Assalamu alaikum. I want to start this one differently than I usually do because this was my first video and this topic deserves it. I made a video a little while ago about the circadian rhythm and Salat, and it reached more people than almost anything I've ever made. And I totally understand why. There's something in the human heart that really lights up when it sees the sacred and the scientific standing in the same room, not fighting each other, like just standing there together. But a 3-minute video really can't hold what this topic actually deserves. So tonight we're going to sit with it properly. No rushing. I want to walk you through the actual research, not the version of it that gets flattened into a caption. And I'm going to be honest with you about where the science ends and where the faith begins, because I think that line matters to me and it should matter to you. My commitment before we start is, I'm not going to tell you the Quran predicted a Nobel Prize. I'm not going to tell you 14 centuries of scholars secretly knew about cortisol. What I am going to tell you is something quieter and I think more honest. And that is that the design of Salat and the design of the human body appear to be speaking the same language. Whether you call it coincidence, resonance, or the signature of a single creator behind both the body and the revelation, that part I will just leave up to you. My job is just to show you what's actually there. So let's just begin with the science, because I want you to trust what I'm building before I bring the Quran into it. 2017, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded to 3 American students, Hall, Rosbash, and Young. For decades, they'd been studying fruit flies, trying to answer this question that sounds simple and turned out to be almost impossibly deep. How does a living body know what time it is? Not by looking at a clock, not by checking a phone from the inside. Every cell in your body, it turns out, is running a kind of chemical stopwatch. Hall, Rosbash, working out of Brandeis, and Young, working out of Rockefeller University, discovered there's a gene at the center of it. They called it period, a protein called PER. It builds up in the nucleus of your cells through the night and gets broken down through the day. Gene, timeless, whose protein TIM, actually helps PER get into the nucleus where it needs to go. So together, these create something researchers call the feedback loop. The protein builds up, it suppresses the gene that made it, and then the protein breaks down and the gene turns back on, and the cycle starts again every 24 hours. In a fruit fly, in you, in me, in every living thing on this planet. This is what Nobel, they said that these 3 scientists were able to look into our biological clock and see its inner workings. They weren't describing a metaphor. They were describing an actual molecular mechanism ticking inside every one of your cells right now as you're listening. And the part that matters for what I want to talk about is that this clock isn't just running quietly in the background. It's actually in charge of far more than your sleep. It's in charge of mood, metabolism, blood pressure, hormone release, immune function, cognitive performance. In fact, a huge percentage of your genes are switched on and off according to this internal rhythm. When that rhythm gets disrupted from work or jet lag, simply like living, against your internal natural timing, the research shows that there is real physiological cost, not just spiritual and moral, but real physiological cost. The body was built to move with a rhythm, and it will get angry and complain very loudly when it's forced to move against it. So this is the science, okay? A real Nobel Prize winning, decades in the making body of research confirming that human beings are wired cell by cell to a 24-hour cycle that is synced to light and dark. Now I want to bring in the second half of this conversation, not to prove anything, but just to notice something. There is a word in Arabic, Fitrah. It shows up in Surah Ar-Rum, where it says, Allah says, so set your face toward the religion, inclining to truth, adhere to the fitrah of Allah upon which He has created all people. No change should there be in the creation of Allah. Fitrah is usually translated as innate nature, the built-in disposition of every human being. If you really sit and think about that, I think it's doing a lot more work than we give it credit for. Because fitrah isn't describing something that's added to you from the outside. It's describing something that was already there, something that is in the design, in the architecture before anyone taught you anything. In the video, I called it the factory setting for the human soul. What strikes me when you sit with both of these ideas is that biology just handed us a very literal, very physical example of exactly this concept. A clock that was never installed by a parent, a teacher, or culture. A clock built into the cell itself. Before you had language or beliefs, before anyone told you when to be tired, when to be awake, Fitrah is in the body. Our genes, right? Because I know that would be overclaiming, and I promised I wouldn't do that. But I am noticing a pattern. Something this book keeps returning to, the idea that the created world carries built in signs or ayats, pointing back towards the one who made it. Not hidden science waiting to be decoded, but just design. It's visible if you're willing to look. And Salat, I think, is where that design really gets named out loud. There is a verse in Surah Al Isra that I want to read to you slowly because I think most of us have heard it and recited, 1,000 times, but not actually hearing it. It says, establish prayer at the decline of the sun until the darkness of the night and the recitation of dawn. Indeed, the recitation of dawn is ever witnessed. Read it again. The decline of the sun, the darkness of the night, the recitation of dawn. It's not abstract language about spirituality in general. This is a verse anchoring worship to very specific, observable physical markers in the sky. And in Surah Ar-Rum, just a few verses before the one on Fitrah, we get, so exalt Allah when you reach the evening and when you reach the morning, and to him is due all praise throughout the heavens and the earth. And exalt him at night and when you are at noon. So that is evening, morning, night, noon. Those are 4 of the 5 prayer windows named directly, tied explicitly to the movement of the sun through the sky. So here's what we're gonna break down for the rest of our time together. The 5 prayers. 5 specific windows in a 24-hour cycle. And underneath each one, a body that is doing something very particular, something that researchers have spent decades measuring in laboratories with instruments that are far more sensitive than anything that was available when these verses were first recited. So let's just walk through them. We're going to start with Fajr, before sunrise. If you have ever tried to wake yourself for Fajr, you know the particular resistance of this hour, okay? The body does not want to move. And there's a very real physiological reason for that. It's got nothing to do with being lazy or weak willed. In the final stretch of nighttime sleep, your body is actually preparing something called the cortisol awakening response. Cortisol is often talked about as the stress hormone, but that's kind of incomplete because it's more like your body's ignition switch. About 30 to 45 minutes after you wake, cortisol shoots up very sharply, sometimes 50 to 75%. Okay? This surge is what mobilizes your energy, sharpens your alertness, and gets the rest of your physiology moving. So, researchers in a controlled lab isolated people from any cues about what time it was. Um, what they found was that this response peaks at a specific circadian phase corresponding to pre-dawn hours. So somewhere around 3:40 in the morning on the body's internal clock, even when the external wake time was shifted. So in other words, this isn't just a reaction to opening our eyes. It is actually scheduled and it's built into the rhythm itself. It's tied to a specific time of the sun. The tension is that that surge takes time to build, which is exactly why moments right after you wake, you feel very foggy and heavy and like resistant. They call this sleep inertia. There's a lag between when you open your eyes and when your brain actually catches up to the alertness. You are quite literally waking into a body that is still like finishing a chemical handoff. So now we sit with Fajr in that light. It doesn't ask you to wait until you feel ready. It asks you to move while the body is still resistant, while the clock is still turning over, while sleep inertia hasn't even lifted yet. And there's something in that I find genuinely moving. The prayer doesn't meet you at your most capable moment. It meets you at your most honest one. Before the coffee, before the composure, before the version of you present to the world is like fully assembled. Fajr catches you in the raw material state and it asks you to surrender there, not later, once you have your stuff together. I think about this in terms of my own background in somatic and nervous system work. So much of our healing, so much of the nervous system regulation happens exactly at the edges like that. Not in the composed, performed version of ourselves, but in the unguarded transition states. Fajr is the transition state, right? It is sleep to waking, darkness to light, unconscious to conscious. And the practice asks you to meet Allah exactly there in that threshold before you've had a chance to curate yourselves. So now we move to Dhuhr, midday. By the time the sun has climbed to its highest point, your body has completed a very different kind of arc. So we have core body temperature, and it reaches its lowest point in the night, and it slowly rises throughout the morning, and it peaks in the midday to early, like afternoon window. It's not a small detail, okay? Because core temperature, your body's core temperature, is one of the primary markers that is used to track your entire circadian system. So your alertness, your reaction time, your working memory, all of that tends to track with your body's temperature, which means midday is for many people close to their peak cognitive performance. It is the sharpest, most capable hours of the day. This is why Dur must interrupt you. And I got to be honest about this because I don't think a lot of us really think about it. Dur often falls in the middle of the most productive stretch of your day. It's when you're in the thick of your job, you're in flow, you're building momentum, you got your kind of energy going. The ego, and I mean that in a psychological sense, not just a spiritual one. Your ego's fully busy, it's engaged, it's fully identified with the task at hand. It's fully convinced that this momentum, this task is the most important thing happening right now. And Salat says, stop. Not because the task doesn't matter, but because you are not the task. The task is not the task. The interruption itself is the teaching. Tafakkur, right, which means contemplation, and tadabbur, which means deep reflection, both require a kind of stepping back, right? Stepping back during that peak productivity actively is what the ego is resisting. Door forces that step back at the exact moment your momentum would tell you not to take it. There's something very confrontational about that in the best way. It's not gentle. It's a very direct challenge to the idea that your worth is measured by how much you produce. Then there's Asr. This is late afternoon. Actually vindicates something that the body already knows. So somewhere between 1 and 4 in the morning, most people experience what researchers call the post-lunch dip. Who skip lunch. It's got nothing to do with digestion, basically. It's circadian. So your body runs two overlapping sleep pressure systems. One that simply builds the longer you've been awake, and one that's tied to your internal clock. In the afternoon, these two align in a way that creates a real measurable dip in your alertness. And then your body temperature also starts to decline. Your cortisol, which is peaked hours earlier, it starts tapering off. So your reaction time is slower, your attention wavers. This has been documented, right? When they had controlled environments looking for meals, postures, awareness of the time, they notice that it's not something you're imagining or manufacturing because of boredom. Your body is asking for stillness. It needs rest. And Asr meets you right there. There's a surah named after this very concept, right? Surah Al-Asr. Chapter 103, one of the shortest chapters, one that believe and do righteous deeds and advise each other to truth and advise each other to patience. By time, not wealth, not intellect, not strength. Time is the axis this entire surah turns on. And it arrives in the naming of our prayers at exactly the hour when the body's own relationship with time starts to kind of fray, when the alertness dips and the pull towards rest gets strong. Asr doesn't fight that dip with more stimulation. It asks you to sit inside of it, to let the low moment become a moment of remembrance instead of a moment you white knuckle with, caffeine and willpower. I think there's real wisdom being modeled there. One that a lot of modern productivity culture actively works against, right? We're taught to push through the afternoon slump, to like caffeinate our way through it, to treat every dip like and engage with it, to let stillness answer a moment the body was already asking for. And then, we have Maghrib at sunset. At sunset, the sun goes down. Your body begins one of its most sensitive transitions, okay? So light exposure is actually the single strongest signal to your circadian clock. And as the light fades, the pineal gland starts to release them. Researchers use something called dim light melatonin onset. It's one of the most reliable markers for our internal circadian timing. It's not a sudden switch flipping. It's a gradual unlocking. Melatonin begins its climb as the darkness settles in. It shifts the whole system from daytime towards nighttime. Now, Maghrib falls right at this threshold, the exact window where the body chemistry is turning from outward and active towards inward and settling. And again, the prayer doesn't happen after the shift has been completed. It happens during it, right? Prayer is it's so assertive. It happens right as the hormonal tide is turning. There's something like tender about that timing. You're not waiting till everything's gone quiet already. It's meeting you in the middle of the turning. Then we have Isha, which is full dark. By the time true darkness has settled, melatonin is well underway. Your cortisol is at its lowest ebb of the day. Your parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest side of your body's stress response, is taking over from, its more active counterpart. This is the physiological equivalent of like when you hold your breath and you finally let it go. The body just downshifts. It starts preparing for deep, restorative sleep. Okay? Isha closes the loop. 5 prayers, 5 distinct physiological checkpoints, moving through cortisol's morning surge, temperatures midday peak, the afternoon circadian dip, the melatonin's evening rise, and then finally the nervous system's full descent into rest. Not one of these prayers falls on a random chosen hour. Each one lands precisely at a hinging point the body is already moving through, whether you are someone who prays or not. So now I want to go back to where I started. I'm not telling you Allah embedded cortisol research into the Quran 1400 years ago as some kind of like hidden scientific miracle waiting for modern instruments to confirm. I don't actually think that framing honors either the science or Islam. What I am telling you is something I find more fortified and durable than that. The same reality that produced a body running on a 24-hour molecular clock also, I believe, produce the guidance calling that body to fit prayer 5 times across that same cycle. Whether you experience that as a coincidence or as design, the pattern itself is not in dispute. It's measurable. It's been measured. Hall, Rosbach, and Young didn't win a Nobel Prize for a theory. They won it for a mechanism, verified in labs, replicated for decades. What Salat asks of you across these 5 windows is something psychologists would recognize as interoception, the practice of turning attention inward toward what the body is actually doing, actually feeling, actually needing, moment to moment. Long before the word existed in a psychology journal, Salat was already training it. Okay, 5 times a day, an invitation to stop performing and start noticing. What is my body doing right now? What is this hour asking of me? Not later, not once I've achieved something, but right now, in whatever state I'm actually in. It calls you to be attentive. I'm a revert. I've walked a long road to get here. Christianity growing up, Hindu, yoga, philosophy, through my teacher training, and Buddhism. And what I've come to believe standing where I stand now is that Fitrah was never asking me to become someone foreign to myself. It was asking me to come back to something that had always been there. To come back to something that was underneath everything that I'd picked up along the way. The body already knew how to keep this rhythm. Salat just gave it a name and a direction and someone to turn towards while it did it. If this is the first time you're hearing any of this laid out in full, I invite you to try something simple over the next 5 days. No, not conversion. Not even belief necessarily, just attention. Notice how your body actually feels at each of these 5 windows. Whether or not you're someone who prays, notice the resistance at dawn, the momentum at midday, the dip in the afternoon, the turning at sunset, the release after dark. See if what the research describes matches what you actually feel in your own body. I suspect it will. And I also suspect if it does, you'll understand something about this practice that no amount of me explaining it to you could ever fully convey.